My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. Within the UFO field, you have everyone from the true scientist who will only deal with what's physically in front of them to the far out fringes of the whole UFO phenomenon. MUFON is really more just left of center, where we try to take a scientific approach by collecting the data first off, and then reviewing the data, investigating the data, and making sure that what we're seeing is actually something that's truly an unknown. MUFON attracts very credible scientific individuals who have a sincere interest in this phenomenon.
My name is John Ventry. I'm the Pennsylvania State Director.
We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on.
My name is Jeremy Ray. I'm a field investigator with the Mutual UFO Network. I've been with them for about 7 years. I've been an investigator in Texas, California, and now Colorado.
We receive about 500 to 1,000 reports per month from around the world. Field investigators will take the case, generally review it, try to come up with a hypothesis, checking star charts, checking different things, and we'll go put an investigation in place to determine what exactly happened. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field. Our speaker tonight is the Honorable Paul Hellyer. Paul is the longest-serving current member of Canadians' Privy Council, having been appointed to the cabinet of Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent in 1957, just 8 years after his first election to the House of Commons in 1949, at the age of 25. He's best known for having unified the Canadian Armed Forces. He was raised as a kid on a farm and has had business experience in everything from manufacturing, retailing, construction, land development, tourism, and publishing. He has also been very active recently in community affairs. And most recently, he has become interested in the whole subject of extraterrestrial presence on our planet and the superior technology that they display. And in September of 2005, he became the first person of a cabinet rank in a G8 nation to state unequivocally that UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. Please join me in a warm welcome for the Honorable Paul Hellyer.
Thank you, Jan. First of all, I'd like to thank Jan for that very interesting and very generous introduction. It reminded me of something that General Eisenhower used to say. about introductions like that they're like chewing gum. It's okay to taste them for a minute or two, but for heaven's sake, don't swallow it. 10 years and 8 hours ago, I stood in Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto and said, quote, UFOs are as real as airplanes flying overhead. If even 3 weeks before that someone had suggested to me that I was going to do something like that, I would have seriously wondered about the state of their mental health, because I had absolutely no thought of doing it. And yet, just in a few weeks, it happened. I guess someone said that the only thing that's constant is change. I don't believe it was serendipity. I believe these things are meant to happen. So the following is a summary of my incredible journey leading up to September the 25th, 2005, and then a few of the highlights of the intervening decade. When I was Minister of National Defense, I received sighting reports, and at the time I was too busy really to look at them. As was stated, I was busy unifying the Canadian Armed Forces, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and putting them all into a single Canadian Defence Force. If you don't think that's a difficult job, it was about as difficult as prying the truth out of the U.S. government on the subject of extraterrestrials and their technology. Apart from that, I was not really too interested. The sightings reports were similar to those of other places. About 80% of the reports were natural phenomena, and the other 20% were genuine UFOs, because they were not explained. Apart from that, about my only connection with the subject was in our centennial year, 1967, when Canada celebrated its 100th birthday, and when we had celebrations in every city and town across the country. And I was invited to go to a little bilingual town in northern Alberta called St. Paul. And they dedicated, or they had me dedicate that day, the world's first flying saucer landing pad. It's still there, you can Google it. And the dedication actually was really very thoughtful and very far-seeing in retrospect. After I left politics, I had barely any interest in the subject. It was not really high on my radar. Until about 13 years ago, a young man from Ottawa, also a bilingual young man by the name of Pierre Junot, started sending me information on this subject. And I told him honestly, I said, Pierre, I haven't got time to read it. And he said, well, don't worry about it. Just put it on a shelf for that proverbial rainy day when you do have. And I said, well, if that's okay with you, it's okay with me. And after a couple of years, he asked me to do one more thing. He said, I'd like you to watch a special being put on ABC Network, put together by the late Peter Jennings, who was also of Ottawa. And so I watched it, and after I watched it, I said, why would all those former United States Air Force officers and former airline pilots and former policemen and air traffic controllers go on that show and say they had seen a UFO if they hadn't? What was in it for them to lie? So this had an impact on me, and I put it away in the back of my cranium. And then Pierre sent me a book called The Day After Roswell. And I don't have much time for reading, but I usually try and read 2 or 3 books during my summer holiday at the Lake Muskoka, where my late wife and I had a little tourist resort. And so I said to myself, well, that would be an interesting book to take to the lake and read next summer. Well, next summer came, couldn't find the book. So I read The Life of Pi instead. And it was very interesting. I must admit that I didn't really know until it was almost at the end whether it was fact or fiction. I finally figured out it was fiction, but it took me quite a while. It was a remarkable tale. Then the following year, which was 2005, I was looking for another book to take and couldn't find it. And there, staring me in the face, was The Day After Roswell. So I said, great, I'll take that with me. And I did, and sat in one of our big, what we call Muskoka chairs, looked out on the lake and started reading. And as I went along, I said, this doesn't sound like fiction. And as I kept going, I was convinced of that because the names of the generals and the airports, the air bases, I recognized from my days in national defense. So one day I was sitting there and my nephew came along, nephew Philip, and said, what are you reading? I told him. He said, well, I'm a skeptic. I said, well, that's all right. You're entitled to be a skeptic. It's a free country, more or less. Getting less every day. And so he went home. He had rented one of the cottages. He went home. 2 days later, he phoned me and said, I phoned the general and told him what you were reading, and he said, every word of it is true and more. Where can I get a copy of the book? So I told him where he could get a copy of the book. And by then I had finished reading the book. And I said to myself, this is authentic. And it should be in the public domain. The American people are entitled to know how much of their money has been spent for these things, the back engineering, whether their Air Force has been shooting at them, and if so, indiscriminately, or how, and if they, continue to do that for any length of time, is it likely to get us involved in an intergalactic war? These are huge issues, and we should be talking about them. They should be matters for discussion and study and intelligent appraisal. So I decided that I had to go public. But before doing so, I had 2 things that I had to do. And the first one was to clear it with my fiancée. Interestingly enough, I had been invited to speak at a symposium in Toronto at the university, sponsored by Victor Vigiani and Mike Bird, 2 Canadian ufologists. And I had absolutely no thought of going. Dare I admit it, it was just procrastination that I hadn't gotten around to let them know. So I decided I would phone them, but not until I cleared with my fiancée, who incidentally was the widow of my best friend ever, and we had known each other for 25 or 30 or 35 years and had a lot in common. So I told her what I wanted to do, and would you believe she was a little bit less than totally enthusiastic. But being the good sport she is, she said, well, if that's what you do and want to do, and if you think it's important to do it, why, I guess it's okay. And I said, well, it'll just be a one-off shot, one speech and that's it. I didn't mean to mislead her, but I guess I really did. And the other thing, of course, was to check with the general. I had met him. I knew him, not well, but I had met him, and so I phoned my nephew and said, get me his telephone number and let him know that I'm going to be calling. So he did, and I phoned him, and before I could even say, hello, how are you, he said, every word is true and more. Just like that, literally. And then he spent the next 20 minutes telling me the more, to the extent that he felt he could, including the fact, he said, United States officials have met face to face with extraterrestrial beings from other star systems. Period. No doubt. So with that assurance, I phoned Victor and Mike and accepted the invitation. And so on September the 25th, 2005, I was the second to last speaker, and others were Stanton Friedman and Richard Nolan and Steve Bassett. And I went to the platform and said UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. And instead of that being a one-off, that was the trigger that began a never-ending journey. The mail began to pour in from all over the world. Documents, some classified, some not. Books. I've never seen so many books come in the mail. And at that time, I took time to read every single one of them. Some were great, some less so, but I learned something from every one of them. And then the briefing started. Dr. Stephen Greer was coming to Toronto and he wanted to see me, so we arranged to get together and sat on the waterfront having lunch, and he gave me a 3-hour briefing. And I must say that he is a man for whom I have the greatest possible respect. He is a titan of ufology. And then Paula Harris, who was here tonight, who had been on the program for that same meeting in Toronto, but who couldn't come because of illness, flew across the ocean to interview me. And she gave me a copy of her book, Connecting the Dots, in which she has her interview with Monsignor Balducci, and where she asked him point blank if he was speaking for the Vatican, and he said no, but the Holy Father was well aware, sometimes listened to the program, and was well aware of what he was saying. So there was tacit approval, if not implicit. And then I got an email from Nick Pope, who was at the time the UFO desk man for the United Kingdom Department of Defense. And he was interested in getting together. It just happened that my wife and I, because we were married by then, were going to the Middle East with a couple of friends from Portland, Oregon. And I intended to mention some things concerning the Middle East, but thought that it would be a good idea to go and take a first-hand look before writing about them. And so I told him when we were going to be in London en route to Tel Aviv, and we had lunch, and he talked as much as he could because he was still under oath, of course, working for the department at the time. But before I left, he gave me 2 files that were in the public domain, including the famous Rendlesham Forest case. And I put it away for a future reference. Later that spring, Dr. Michael Salas, who I understand is writing a new book or just finished it, invited me to give the keynote address at Extraterrestrial Civilizations and World Peace Conference at Kona Kalua, Hawaii. I don't know if you've ever been in this position or not, but I have several times of being the keynote speaker where everyone in the audience knows more about it than I do. And that was certainly true at the time. But by then, and I have numb thumbs, so I probably am getting the pages separated here. Just bear with me for a minute. Because I was not and never will be a ufologist. I'm a politician, a military observer, and an economic maverick, very frustrated with the way the world banking and financial system works. And I have a story to tell. And so I went to tell my story. For a bit of melodramatics, a CIA agent phoned, and Paula Harris decided that I shouldn't speak to him because she was afraid that if I did, I might be compromised in some way. So she managed, I don't know how, she would have made a good hockey player. She stick-handled around. And after 3 days, he still hadn't been able to get through to me somehow. But that wasn't, of course, the end of the story. While we were there, Mike Bird was there, and I asked him the first night where there was a good place to eat. He said, down at the end of the corner here. So I said, let's go, and we got down there, and he said, there's one of the presenters coming up. And he told me who it was, and I said, well, why don't you ask him and his wife to join us? And so it was Captain Robert Salas and his wife. And he told his story, which was absolutely fascinating, of course. And his amazement, consternation, and concern when a flying saucer just outside the fence of the base where he was the deputy commander, I think it was, put 7 Minuteman I missiles out of operation. And it was one of those cases which turned out to be more thoroughly investigated than just about anything I know of. There were several investigations. And I don't know if there was ever any definite conclusion as to whether they had been put out of operation deliberately or whether it was just because of the electromagnetic interference of the space vehicle on the control mechanisms for the missiles. It's a very interesting subject. Well, then in February 2007, my wife and I visited the Washington National Prayer Breakfast. Her late husband had been very active in the prayer breakfast movement, and she and her husband, and sometimes my late wife and I had gone together. But neither of us had been there for a while, so we decided we would go that year. And I found out that Colonel Halt lived not too far from Washington, so I got in touch with him. He said, normally when I get a letter or an invitation on that subject, I just don't even bother answering it. He said, but if you are recommended by Nick Pope, I will see you. So I got a car and drove down to his gated compound, and we had lunch together, and I interviewed him for about 2 hours, and it was recorded and later transcribed. And when I published, finally, my book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, a survival plan for the human species, I put in a fairly extensive account of that interview because it covered so many things that you would be familiar with. The original skepticism when the NCOs came in and said that there'd been a sighting. And everybody says, ha ha, we've heard something like that before, and on with business. But then on Christmas night, when they were having their banquet, and it was again reported that there was a sighting out in the forest, his commanding officer was handing out awards like Jan was tonight, so he said, halt, you go and look after this situation. And according to the colonel, he said, I went out of that room saying to myself, I'm going to put an end to this damn nonsense once and for all. Well, when he got down there with his party and saw the real thing, it changed his life forever. He has been very active recently in trying to spread the word, and actually he's been subject to quite a bit of interference, and he doesn't deserve it because he's a very devout citizen of the United States and of the world. Well, later that year, I attended the 5th Annual UFO Crash Retrieval Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada. By then, I had decided to write Light at the End of the Tunnel and include a chapter entitled We Are Not Alone in the Cosmos. And I wanted to listen to presentations to determine what they knew that I didn't know. And I always find that they do, always learning new things. It was sponsored, of course, by Ryan Wood and his father, Bob. I'm sorry. It was great to see you tonight. Come and be recognized for the wonderful work that you have done, and it was a great experience to meet you on that occasion and to get to know you a little bit. And one of the things that I learned was from one of the presenters said that they had found in their investigations in Area 51 that if you electrify the leading edge of a vehicle, that you can reduce the drag by 90%. Well, I checked that out with one of my prime sources, and he said, well, he'd never heard a figure that high. A figure he had heard was perhaps 70%. But I've often thought to myself since that even if it was 50 or 60%, if there's a commercial application for it, we should have had it out and in operation years ago in order to save a lot of fuel and a lot of pollution. Nothing further has been heard about it. At least I haven't heard anything about it since that date. Well, then Ryan arranged a private briefing for Bob and I on Area 28. And the briefing was done by former intelligence officers who had worked there, and they claimed they weren't telling us anything that they shouldn't be. Even then, it was a very interesting experience. They had a Google map taken from space, and I'll never forget the trucks going across the desert. They looked like toy trucks about an inch long, but they were, in fact, of course, huge trucks. And they would be going in tandem across the desert and then just disappear down a hole. And it wasn't discussed as to what was going on down there. Some people believe that that's one of the places where they were testing new weapon systems. But it's an area of the desert that is very seldom mentioned. While I was there, I had lunch with Linda Moulton Howe, author of Glimpses of Other Realities, High Strangeness. And I read her book. I read it carefully, and I just decided it was wonderful, but it's not for beginners, because there are quite a few strange realities, and they're becoming more all the time. as I learned more about the subject. Well, I had a major coup, two major coups actually. Because I'd arranged to talk to a couple of abductees while I was out there. And the first one was Travis Walton of Fire in the Sky, a naval rating, U.S. naval rating that I knew was a close friend of his. And he let me know that Walton wanted to see me. So we got in touch, and it was only an hour flight, I think, from where he lived to Las Vegas. And he and his wife came and spent the weekend there for the symposium. And I interviewed him at length. I can't remember exactly how long, maybe 2.5 hours, something like that, but then spent time with him during the course of the weekend, a lot of time. And by the time it was over, I was thoroughly convinced that he was telling the truth. And the other one was Jim Sparks, one of the most abducted people that I have heard of, abducted dozens and dozens of times. And unlike many abductees, usually he was fully conscious. And so he learned a lot, and they even taught him their language, which is most unusual. And Jim gave me permission to copy a major exchange that he had with ETs from his book, The Keepers, An Alien Message for the Human Race. And it was interesting to me that most of his contact, almost all of his contact, had been with the Greys until this last episode, when he was picked up by 9 reptilians and taken to a deserted amusement park and had a long discussion with them. And he was told the same story repeated over and over again. We Earthlings are not good stewards of our planet. Fast forward. Light at the End of the Tunnel was published. It got good reviews, and the never-ending round of conferences, radio and TV shows really accelerated. And then in May 2013, I was one of the 40 witnesses Steve Bassett had rounded up for his citizens disclosure hearing in Washington at the press club. I'll try and reduce the length of the description of what was going on there, but Steve had recruited 6 former congresspeople, 5 Congress ladies and men, and 1 former senator, who were all skeptics. And he put together 40 witnesses to appear before them. They gave they acted as a congressional panel, and they took evidence under oath. So we started out Monday morning with 6 skeptics, and as the week went on, we managed to convince one after another. I was the last speaker. I turned down a chance to speak during the week, and I was the last speaker on Friday afternoon, and by then there was only one holdout, and that was the chair for that day. Former congressman, and he was very skeptical. But what I decided about 24 hours before I spoke was that what I had prepared to say was so trite that I just tore up my notes and got some scrap paper and wrote down some headings and then talked about first a couple of things that the chair was interested in. He said, well, what are some of the species? And nobody had answered him, and where do they come from? So I had my copy of My Light at the End of the Tunnel there, and I just quoted 5 or 6 species and their places of origin for him. And then I went on to talk about what is really going on. Who is running the United States? Not the President and Congress, but a cabal. The cabal, briefly described, would be an amorphous group headed by the banking cartel at the top. They're the ones with the most power because they print the money. And so they call a lot of the shots. And then next to them would be the oil cartel, who are insisting on cashing in their trillions of dollars worth of assets, even though our planet's on fire, metaphorically speaking, and they don't seem to give a darn about it, as long as they can keep on making money. And then the heads of the transnational corporations, the CEOs of the transnational corporations. And then the intelligence agencies, parts of them, especially the CIA and the FBI and then the NSA, but the British MI6 and the Mossad are involved as well. And I only mentioned one name, which was David Rockefeller, and that was simply because in his memoirs, he had spoken of the idea of a world run by bankers and the elite. And frankly, they've been running the world for quite a while, and I think they've made quite a mess of it. And I personally am not anxious to see them take over on a permanent basis with their new world order, as they call it, because I think it is a new world order designed for their benefit and at the very great expense of the rest of us. But after being there and noting the naivety of the members of Congress and the lack of information that they had been indirectly authorizing the expenditures of hundreds of billions of dollars for projects that they'd never heard of. Totally in the dark. So I decided to write another book with a fuller view of world affairs and who is really pulling the strings. So I worked feverishly to produce a book, The Money Mafia, World in Crisis. And I don't make my living from selling books, but I really want to put in a plug for this one because it is the only book I know of that has an action plan listing the things that have to be done to restore constitutional government to America. And so I commend it to you. Meanwhile, more information kept pouring in, just when it seemed to be needed most. In 2013, Paula Harris asked me to do a keynote at her Starworks USA UFO Symposium. And I knew that she wanted to talk about ufology for a change. So I was wondering what to say. I turned my chair around at the desk in our condo, and there, staring me in the face, was a book by Len Kasten, The Secret History of Extraterrestrials. I don't know how it got there, I didn't buy it. I asked Glenn when I finally caught up with him if he'd sent it to me, and he said no, but there it was. And among the other revelations that were included in the book, he talked about the Eben exchange with the 12 brave Americans who boarded an alien spaceship and flew through 38 light years to Serpo, the home planet of the Greys. Friends told me not to use the story. They said it's a hoax. So I checked with my most reliable source and was told, no, it is authentic. As I said, it's the one and only time that my speech has been 100% ufology, and I'm not about to repeat it. I've met Len Kasten at the Alien Cosmic Expo in Brantford, Ontario, Canada, last June, where we were both presenters, and got a copy of his latest book, Secret Journey to Planet Serpo, a true story of interplanetary travel. The book is jam-packed with details of how 12 American military heroes prepared to leave on an alien spacecraft in July 1965, and with the help of time warp and a wormhole, to reach Serpo in just 10 months. If I had more time, that means traveling about 40 times the speed of light. The book is highly recommended. If I had more time tonight, I would tell you a little more of what is in it, but I'm going to talk more about it tomorrow in the one-on-one. Interestingly enough, the book is full of details that were leaked by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, including direct quotes from the mission commander from his diary. As I said, I'll elaborate tomorrow because they were supposed to stay there 10 years and they stayed 13 years because they couldn't tell the time. Their watches stopped working, and the way they tell time on Serpo is different than we do on Earth, so they lost track of it and stayed an extra 3 years. And incidentally, one of their group died on the way, the trip there, and 2 more while they were there, and 2 elected to stay there when the rest came home, and 7 came home at the end of 13 years and reported voluminously on all of the things that they had learned and studied while they were there. Fascinating material. And what I'm most interested in, and we'll be talking about tomorrow, is how their lifestyle and how they live and what they do and the way they do it, which they have already managed to translate into changes in about 5 planets, not too far from their own, how we would react if some of the same changes took place here, and how concerned we should be that that might happen to us at some stage. Because their ways are not our ways, and they may impact Earthlings in the future, and very important questions are raised. An even more startling revelation in Kasten's book is the role the reptilians played from their entrenched bases in Asia in Hitler's rise to power, and the inevitable question of who they may be backing now and why. Other information that came to me while I was writing The Money Mafia was a book on the inside story of 9/11, probably the greatest deception with the most far-reaching consequences in history. Then another was the Battle of Dulce, involving U.S. troops and one or more species of ETs. Each of these revelations and the questions they raised had urgency to our demand for full disclosure. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder what I would say here, the amazing Timothy Good, who I met in London, England last November, when my wife and I stopped there for a couple of days on the way home from visiting the battlefields of World Wars I and II, and wondering whether perhaps the millions of people who died had died in vain, if we were holding the torch high. Incidentally, Tim has been in the immediate presence of extraterrestrials on 3 occasions, he told me. So he sent me his latest book, which is called Earth, an Alien Enterprise. Isn't that a fascinating subject? Earth, an Alien Enterprise. Not only an amazing array of case histories from around the world, he enlarged my knowledge of the vast underground and underwater bases and the presence of the old ones who may have been living on this planet for eons. I was brought up short by a quotation that he had from a military team who were warned, and I quote, "Our own activities required monitoring by others than human beings, simply because Earth is a vital and necessary planet for others." I guess that means that our planet is not expendable, but we Earthlings may be. It is a vital and necessary planet for others. We could not be permitted to despoil it, even though despoliation has begun, and we were doubted as to our integrity and genuine concern for the planet and its myriad life forms. The aliens reiterated the overpopulation of Earth combined with pollution and said it would lead to catastrophe. My own view is that it's not too late yet, but if we don't smarten up, and very soon, it may be. The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis, is not exclusive to any one aspect, but tries to tie them all together in a united whole. Inevitably, there were important omissions. My audiologist, who is very much interested in ufology, gave me a copy of Chemtrails, HAARP, and the Full Spectrum Dominance of Planet Earth by Elena Freeland. I can't think of a faster way to get one's blood boiling. It is almost beyond belief to learn the lengths to which the cabal will go and what our next move should be. Well, I don't want to end on a note of doom and gloom. I've never written a book about how bad things are without suggesting how to set them right. And I have a postscript in my book which says the missing link is spirituality. There are many good things happening in the world. I list some of them. Dozens and dozens of them. Wonderful people doing wonderful things, helping others, starting projects to end the misery of thousands of people who otherwise are without hope. But we need tens of thousands of those. We need to change our values. We have to abandon the worship of mammon and cherish our planet and its inhabitants in accordance with the will of the Creator. I am not a Catholic, but I have admired several of the things that the Pope has said recently. He gets my vote because he's about the only world leader I know who is telling the truth. We're destroying our planet, and the perpetual war created by the military-industrial complex, which is an integral part of the cabal, is creating perpetual poverty for the masses. The world is in crisis, and only a moral and spiritual revolution can save it, starting with each of us trying to sublimate our ego and think of others who may need some kind of assistance. It is the only hope for light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.